Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the IMO policy measures. Thank you to the panelists for joining the session. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor on Shipping Decarbonization at the Global Maritime Forum, leading the Policy Action Group of the Getting to Zero Coalition, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Let me start by introducing the Getting to Zero Coalition. The Getting to Zero Coalition was launched in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit, uniting around 50 companies aiming to have commercially viable zero-emission ships in deep-sea operation by 2030, supported by fuel production and bunkering infrastructure towards full decarbonization by 2050. Today, the coalition counts over 200 members from across the maritime value chain that support this shared ambition. Whilst members of the Getting to Zero Coalition are already taking concrete action, for example, through pilot projects, green corridors, and other first mover projects, these investments cannot continue without ambitious policy frameworks at the IMO. The revised greenhouse gas strategy adopted in July 2023 is a key milestone, not only for shipping, but the global community as a whole. Currently, policy measures and combinations thereof to deliver on the strategy are under development in order to ensure the delivery of the new strategy. Together with our speakers today, this webinar aims to explore how the different elements of these measures can contribute to the strategy's broader objectives of promoting an energy transition, while also enabling a just and equitable transition. I will first share some insights of a recent insight brief, which is entitled Unraveling IMO Policy Measures Towards a Just and Equitable Energy Transition, which you can find on our website together with other insight briefs. And it was written closely together with UMass. And this presentation will be followed by a presentation by Roel Hoenders from the IMO on the process of the comprehensive impact assessments. And finally, we will dive deeper into the elements of the policy measure debate with our panelists, which I will introduce later on in this session. So if we can start with the presentation. Through 4 slides, I will present the main messages of our insight brief. What now? Following the adoption of the revised strategy, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee has agreed to develop midterm measures to deliver on the strategy. This consists of multiple steps, of which a key step is the Comprehensive Impact Assessment, or CIA. Some people also call it the CIA, but I call it the CIA. Roel will give some more explanation about this process more in depth later on. The CIA, overseen by a steering committee consisting of multiple countries and observer organizations, is tasked with exploring the various impacts that different combinations of measures could have. And this work includes a literature review which has been performed by the World Maritime University, the impact of measures on the fleet, which is currently being analyzed by DNV, and also the impact on states, which will be analyzed by UNCTAD, and also other specific case studies or some specific case studies will be looked at as well. If we can go to slide 2. With the adoption of the revised strategy, the discussion of policy measures has moved into a new phase, going beyond individual proposals into discussions about possible combinations of various elements to support the development of the measures. And these elements include a greenhouse gas fuel intensity target, flexibility measures, a pricing mechanism, and revenue disbursement areas. The actual decisions on how these can be combined will be crucial to define the transition. If we can then go to slide 3. Specifically, the transition can take 2 ways: an incremental transition or an early transition. An incremental transition, which is the blue line on the graph, where industry progressively lowers its greenhouse gas intensity until around 2040, when the whole fleet moves to scalable zero-emission fuels. Or secondly, an early 2-speed transition, so the green line, where early uptake of zero-emission fuels is incentivized as much as possible with the diminishing remainder of shipping using higher greenhouse gas intensity options. The guiding principle for selecting the basket of midterm measures must be their capacity to deliver on the goals and checkpoints of the 2023 strategy. An early transition is therefore the preferred pathway, as potential learnings can help reduce costs, support infrastructure, and, very importantly, avoid stranded assets of low carbon options after or by 2040. To support this, both a fuel standard and a global pricing mechanism are required. A pricing mechanism will help close the gap, especially when revenues are used partially as a subsidy regime targeted at zero-emission fuels. Furthermore, ensuring a just and equitable transition hinges to a large extent on revenue disbursement. A fuel standard provides certainty for the industry, as it sets clear greenhouse gas fuel intensity targets. However, investments in zero-emission fuel technologies during the transitional period will remain uncertain, as there will be multiple ways to comply with lower GFI standards through, for example, biofuels or LNG. In this regard, the more the well-to-wake approach is embraced in the international negotiations, the less likely we will end up with stranded assets. If we can go to slide 4. A GFI standard alone cannot enable a just and equitable transition. Such a transition has various elements and means something else to different states, including addressing disproportionate negative impacts of measures, support for mitigation and adaptation, and technological inclusivity. It is crucial that a proportion of the revenue from a pricing mechanism is used to enable the just and equitable transition, including through mitigating trade cost impacts, in-sector mitigation support, fuel production in the global south, technology transfer, and out-of-sector adaptation. That was a bit the context of the Insight Brief. Again, you can find much more in-depth text, of course, on our website. Firstly, I'd like to give the floor to Roel Hoenders, the head of climate action and clean air at the International Maritime Organization, where he's responsible for IMO's regulatory agenda on the reduction of atmospheric pollution from ships in line with MARPOL Annex 6 and the implementation of IMO's revised greenhouse gas strategy. Roel will give some further insights on the process of the comprehensive impact assessment. I invite you to post questions in the chat for a Q&A session on the presentation and the findings specifically. We will most likely not be able to get back to everyone during the webinar, but we will make sure to answer them through writing shared with everyone who registered to today's webinar. So, Roel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ludovic, for that introduction and also for that excellent introduction to the work that IMO currently is heavily engaged in. Thanks also to GTZ for inviting the IMO Secretariat to this very timely panel, I would say. We're just a couple of days away from a very exciting 2 weeks ahead of us, negotiating amongst other topics, the further development of what we call the midterm greenhouse gas reduction measures. And so this is the first meeting since MEPC 80, the session which adopted the IMO 2023 greenhouse gas strategy last July. And so it's really a good momentum again for delegations, for governments, for observer organizations to come together and discuss all the various strands of work on greenhouse gas emission reductions that we are currently engaged in and which should jointly ensure that we achieve the targets, the greenhouse gas targets that were agreed by governments last July. We have a very packed agenda for the coming next 2 weeks. Ludovic, you mentioned a couple of key aspects on that agenda. Obviously, the work on the midterm measures, the basket of midterm measures, the associated comprehensive impact assessment, but also on the further development of our life cycle greenhouse gas assessment framework. So really the well-to-wake calculation methodology. There is a number of documents to be discussed related to onboard carbon capture technology, a topic that is we see emerging also in relevance. So that's on the agenda as well for the coming 2 weeks, as well as the review process of the short-term greenhouse gas measures, but notably the carbon intensity indicator, or the CII. So very busy. But we're looking forward to working with everybody in these 2 weeks ahead. Now, with respect to the discussion on measures, the candidate measures, and Ludovic, you already gave a very good overview, so I can be quite short on that. The committee indeed, at the last session, MEPC agreed on the development of a basket of measures consisting of both a technical element, also known as kind of the greenhouse gas fuel standard, as well as an economic element or a greenhouse gas pricing element. And jointly, these two components should really enable an energy transition and allowing for the uptake of alternative low carbon, zero carbon fuels and technologies. We roughly see that there are still about 7 different proposals for measures being put forward by different groups of countries, as well as by industry and other organizations. So key is really for delegations in the weeks ahead to further understand each other's positions on these, on their respective proposals, in order to identify possible convergence, also taking into account the results of that very important impact assessment process that you just mentioned, Ludovic. So that brings me actually to where we are today in terms of the analysis of impacts of the various proposals of measures. Immediately after MEPC 80, the Secretariat established a so-called steering committee that was tasked by governments to oversee the conduct of this impact assessment process. The impact assessment process is a requirement which is actually laid down in the greenhouse gas strategy. And it's a very important element of our work to make sure that whatever we're going to do in terms of policy development is inclusive, but also looks into any kind of unwanted impacts of the measures which are on the table. The impact assessment process will also look into how the measures, the proposals can actually effectively deliver on the greenhouse gas targets that have been agreed last July. And also part of this discussion is then to have information on the table that will help the negotiators in identifying possible ways in legal texts, in guidelines on how to address any identified impacts. Now, overall, the work is progressing very well. There's an impressive amount of work carried out by these members of the steering committee. The steering committee consists of around of 32 countries, which is a very well-balanced representation of the various geographic regions around the world, as well as size of countries and interest in maritime transport. And jointly, they have identified a work plan for this impact assessment, and there are 5 tasks which are important individually, but also mutually support each other. So the first one is a literature review, which is almost finished, and that has been carried out by our friends in the World Maritime University, WMU. Task 2 is the assessment of the proposals on the fleet. And that actually looks into what are the cost implications of the various proposals on the fleet operating around the world. The contract for looking into that assessment of the impacts on the fleet has been awarded to DNV following a procurement and following a review of the bids that we had received for the procurement by the members of the steering committee. Now, the members of the steering committee had a very tough cookie to crack in finding a way to model, so actually to identify a way translating the various proposals for measures on the table into tangible input for modeling by DNV. In the end, the steering committee members identified two initial modeling scenarios that reflect the combinations of these technical and economic elements. And that was forwarded to DNV to carry out their modeling. And that modeling includes how, for instance, funds, revenue, flexibility mechanisms would have to be incorporated, and what kind of impact that would have on the overall cost of the fleet. So for instance, how to incorporate a reward mechanism in the modeling was all part of these discussions and is part of these 21st modeling scenarios put forward to DNV. Another key element in the discussions of the member states in the steering committee was how to incorporate the well-to-wake approach in the modeling by DNV. And there are, probably you're aware of that, there's still some divergent views on how to reflect the well-to-wake approach, which is referred to in the greenhouse gas strategy into the modeling. DNV has done a great job in providing some initial modeling results within the very limited time frame that they had available. The steering committee had an initial discussion of these results, but they are not mature enough yet actually to be presented during the meeting next week and the week after. However, the steering committee already agreed on additional dates for meetings, so the heavy work pace will continue also after MEPC to make sure that we have tangible results. Now, following the analysis done by DNV, that input of the impacts on the fleet will have to be fed into the analysis of impacts on states. And that analysis will be carried out by our sister organization, UNCTAD, which is the responsible organization within the UN system for trade and assessing any trade relevant impacts. And so UNCTAD, using a model called the GTAP model, will actually, on the basis of the results of DNV, then assess what kind of impacts can be expected in terms of primarily of GDP change resulting from maritime transport cost increases or decreases, on the overall economy and the GDP of individual states. So again, this is a very important task, which is enshrined in the strategy. It will allow for informed and evidence decision-making by the committee in its work ahead. There are a couple of key issues that still need to be clarified by the steering committee. And that relates at this point in time, particularly on how to model carbon revenue, carbon disbursements as proposed in the different measures into the overall modeling, and how to assign that to individual states. So this is a very important discussion that we will still are going to have in the coming weeks, in the coming months, and maybe the committee, MEPC, and the intersessional working group will provide some additional cues on that to facilitate the modeling. Task 4 of the impact assessment, very briefly, is a so-called stakeholder analysis exercise that will be carried out for 10 identified countries across the different geographical regions. And this stakeholder analysis will actually zoom in on specific commodities, around 3 commodities for each of these 10 countries. And by zooming in on these commodities, the country will have a better idea of what the impacts, what the potential cost increase, decrease will imply for some of their key export or import commodities. So again, this is an exercise that will complement the modeling done by UNCTAD, but quite important in order to make sure that we do not overlook any undesired impacts. So all in all, the impact assessment process is progressing well. It's progressing in time or in accordance with the timelines that were identified in the greenhouse gas strategy. It's complex, but the spirit, I would say, the spirit of cooperation within the steering committee, the exchanges between member states, despite their divergencies, is really, really constructive. And so we're very grateful actually for all those member states representatives that have devoted a lot of time and energy into this work, which comes, of course, on top of their existing workload. Results, primarily results of the impact assessments we foresee for roughly end of May, early June, and that will allow for some time between MEPC 81 and the next meeting, MEPC 82, which will basically take place at the beginning of October. So it will allow for some time to for these results to be digested, potentially to be discussed in any kind of intersessional meeting, sometime June, July period, and then for member states to take into account these results of the impact in their further work. So I think that's where we are today in terms of impact assessment work. Maybe 2 words, Ludovic, if you allow me, about the development of the LCA, so the life cycle greenhouse gas assessment work. Extremely important work element that really is intrinsical to development of the measures and any other work that this organization, that the IMO, is going to do on greenhouse gas reduction. MEPC 80 established a correspondence group which has developed amendments to the guidelines, the LCA guidelines that were adopted last July. There are also important recommendations on how to have continuous review, expert review, and additional expert work done on this topic of identifying and further defining the life cycle greenhouse gas assessment framework. So I think where we are today in terms of the overall workload on greenhouse gas issues, as I mentioned, I think we're progressing very well in time and in accordance with the timeline set out in the strategy. Everyone is very committed to this work. I think if we look at the intensity, the frequency of meetings of the International Working Group, of MEPC, but also of that steering committee on the impact assessment group, correspondence group, expert group meetings, seminars that are being organized by the proponents of measures, we can really see that everybody is very committed to this work. Obviously, there are high expectations for the upcoming sessions. I think the sessions, as I mentioned, will help for delegations to really understand each other's positions and where there's possible convergence possible. I know that some of you wish to see, concrete text proposals or other concrete tangible results, but in the IMO, sometimes we need to let things simmer a little bit to allow for informal exchanges, increased understanding before the pen comes to paper. But we've done this before. We're well on track in accordance with the timeline. So we remain very positive and look very forward to work with everybody in the upcoming 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roel. Spot on time. But still, I would like to take one question from Maria Schipper-Schwen. Hi, Maria. It's related to the 5% target of near zero fuels by 2030. Will the regulation be measured up against the absolute reduction target of 20 or 30% by 2030? In other words, will the GFS indirectly, by greenhouse gas intensity requirements, mandate the use of e-fuels? So it's actually, how will the IMO regulation take care of the 5%? How do you see that happening? If you can just highlight a bit that aspect.
Yeah, sure. Very good question, Maria, as always. Thanks for that. I think the response to that is twofold. So when it comes to the actual proposals by the different groups of member states and other organizations, there is clearly a reference made in their proposals to achieving both the absolute greenhouse gas reduction targets as well as this 2030 fuel and energy efficient technology uptake target. So in the proposals, it's well reflected. I think the difficulty where we are now is in how to model in the impact assessment process, how to actually model whether the individual proposals put forward are actually able to achieve both of these targets. And rest assured, this is absolutely not forgotten. The members of the steering committee, and there's one here represented today in the panel, are collectively very vigilant that we do not forget anything that has been agreed in the strategy in the modeling exercise. But I have to confess that it does require a bit of head scratching on how to actually model these kind of targets which we have agreed upon in the strategy. But I'm sure that the members of the steering committee will find a way forward to do that, so that we can effectively report on how this will be achieved by the different proposals on the table right now.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Okay, it's time for the panel discussion. And before we get into the discussion, thank you very much, Roel, again. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We have Jasper Faber, who is working as a policy advisor, sustainable shipping at the Dutch Ministry of Transport, responsible for IMO greenhouse gas issues and EU national decarbonization policies. Jasper has a long track record in the industry, or in the international negotiations, particularly through his prior roles at Sea Delft. Then we have Numbu Sumabe, who is the Maritime Administration Officer at the Ghana Maritime Authority, following the IMO greenhouse gas discussions at the IMO closely. Then Narinder Goyal, currently serving as the President of New Initiatives at Avada Group, which is a green energy company in India, where he heads up their green ammonia business. Mr. Goyal has a long background in the chemical and fertilizer industries before turning to working on new fuels for shipping. The next is Sanne Frias Hendriksen. She's head of decarbonization, public and regulatory affairs at AP Moller Maersk, with previous roles in the public sector, including the Danish delegation to the IMO, where she followed up the greenhouse gas files closely, and of course still is. And then finally, we have Catherine Benz, who is the senior policy manager for the Aspen Institute, where she works with the cargo owners on the Zero Emission Vessel, or COSEF initiative, and their latest Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, also called ZEMBA, which is a prominent voluntary system. So starting with Jasper. Jasper, the Netherlands is an important shipping hub, active in the development of green corridors with the port of Rotterdam and Amsterdam as key players. What would you like to see from the policy measures to be able to scale up efforts such as green corridors and ensure a full, just and equitable transition to zero emission shipping? Can you give us some thoughts on that? Jasper, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludovic, and that is an intriguing question. I think most important, what the policy measures should achieve is that IMO demonstrates that it stands by the goals of the strategy, and I would emphasize all the goals of the strategy. So not only the emission reduction goal, but also the 5 to 10% of zero greenhouse gas fuels that were already mentioned in the Q&A with Roel, contributing to a just and equitable transition and addressing disproportionately negative impacts as appropriate. Because with the current strategic targets, I think the main bottleneck for greening maritime transport is in sight, but has not yet been achieved, because only on the basis of the strategic targets, no shipping company, I think, can guarantee offtake agreements of very expensive fuels like zero greenhouse gas fuels. For that, requirements and pricing mechanisms have to be put in place that enable the further development of those goals. And those are also at the core of the EU proposals to the next session of the intersessional and MEPC. Only when we have a credible mix of policy instruments, and according to the timeline in the strategy, we have to adopt the policy instruments next year. So by that time, we will have further clarity on what exactly will be the requirements that IMO puts on ships, and that to decarbonize. Only with that policy instrument do the green corridors that many of my colleagues are working so hard to develop make any sense as a, let's say, a first try out of how future shipping could work with future shipping, because by 2050 and already by 2040, we need to have a global coverage of green fuels and green corridors and ships that are able to meet them.
Okay, thank you, Jasper. The next question is for Numbu. From your perspective as a developing nation, looking ahead at the upcoming discussions at the IMO, what do you need to see from the policy measures to ensure Ghana does not stay behind in this energy transition? Numbu, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so Ghana, just like many of the developing countries, the fact is that a lot of our countries have not been able to undertake their own internal studies to determine the possible disproportionate negative impact that will come from these measures. And that is why we are actually grateful to the IMO for initiating the comprehensive impact assessment. But that notwithstanding, we have a lot of things that we are looking out for based on the proposals that have been submitted on the technical and economic measures. Without appearing to show prejudice to any of the proposals, I'll just go ahead to share my views on some of our expectations as a developing country. The first is the energy transition. Here is the case. A lot of these developing countries do not have the technology. The technology is mostly from and has already been developed, and it's been developed by companies and governments in the developed and the global north. So we'll be interested in looking at how such technology can be transferred, and also we'll also be looking at that there are some countries, especially in Africa, countries like Namibia, Morocco, who are first movers in energy production. So we'll try to assess how within the intermediate period, how guarantees can be made for off-takers for this energy that is going to be produced, considering that the market is being dictated by the major shipping companies in the world, based on the areas of interest that, in terms of the fuel technology that they are developing. Yes. So we'll also be looking at how with the fleets, the fleet of most developing countries do not have the capacity, much capacity as those in the developed world. So we'll be looking at how incentives, how incentives can be guaranteed even after the major fleets, world fleets have moved. They have reached the innovation period, because perusing some of the proposals that have been put forward, the incentives will be from the funds, the funds that will be generated from contributions or from buying of remedial units and all that. So when these companies are able to move, they're able to complete the transition, and those fleets in the developing world are expected to lag behind. So how do we ensure that there's continuous funding for these countries? And also, I would like to delve into for these companies in the developed world. I also like to delve into the aspect of the just transition, and we are, as I mentioned, we are waiting on the outcome of the comprehensive impact assessment. But we can actually perceive like my country, for instance, and other countries within Africa, who are developing countries, we are highly import-driven economies, and we can see. So we are mindful of the type of economic element that will be decided upon, and how that will add to the cost of maritime logistics, and which obviously will be transferred to the final consumer. And already most of these countries are having economic meltdowns. They are having economic challenges. So we'll try to assess the situation to ensure that we don't agree with any measure that will actually add more woes to our country's economic predicament. And so we'll be looking at how these funds, the midterm measures, can address in terms of just transition in this aspect. So it cuts across both within the in-sector, maritime sector, and also addressing the likely economic impacts. And also we'll be looking at revenue disbursement. We have high interest in that. It is something, though a fund has not been agreed, the type of GHG pricing mechanism has not been agreed upon yet. But I think it is high time we start to talk about how the revenues will be disbursed to countries that need it, to vulnerable countries. Because I'll just come to, I'll cite Africa as an example again. If you look at developing Africa, there are various categories of developing countries. Most of developing Africa, they are just low-income economies. We also have the LGCs and the CIPs, and also the developed world. So it is high time we actually talk about the methods, the revenue disbursement to these countries, which obviously differ based on the capacities of these countries. And also we'll be looking at how the host institution for these funds, you know, the funds, whether IMO or non-IMO. And I personally believe that in-sector projects should be funded through IMO, and with the nature of the proposals, with emphasis on well-to-wake approach, it means that it will also cover out of sector. So the other institutions too, international financial institutions that will be in charge of that, if there's a proposal to that aspect of dealing with this other out of sector or even hosting the whole fund, it is something that we are looking out for, because I know that there are a lot of funds stuck in some of these green financial institutions, because the application process or how to access these funds is very cumbersome. So we're looking at how maybe these measures can provide a very easy way, if such a fund is hosted within this International Financial Organization, how access can be enabled without going through much red tape. So basically, we also look at how, for instance, because the emphasis is on in future, like finally on well-to-wake, we'll look at how the measures can help fund alternative energy production activities in a win-win situation. Most developing countries they have valuable renewable energy resources, but they're getting finance for this project is high capital, and we'll be more interested in projects or in funds that will use PPP arrangements as a number one basis in funding such energy projects, to ensure that the respective countries actually benefit from such investments. Otherwise, we'll have multinational corporations coming to invest and taking everything away without we getting this equitable transition. Yes. So basically, these are our expectations as a developing country. So we hope that there'll be convergence in the proposals in a way that will actually take care of countries that will be much impacted in the transition, considering that we contribute little to climate change and we are suffering the most from the impacts as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Numu. Thank you for that. The next question is to Sanaf from Maersk. Maersk is already investing heavily in green shipping, but how do you see the various policy measures impact the business case for investing in green fuel-ready vessels? And what would you need from those measures? Sanne, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So at Maersk we have set a target to get to net zero in 2040 across our business. And actually we have just announced that we had our target verified also under SBTi. So we're really committed to do this, but we cannot do it alone. We have started executing on the strategy and have ordered so far 25 vessels, dual fuel vessels that can sail on green methanol, and we already have the first ones operating and several more coming into operations of large container vessels of 17,000 TEU the coming couple of years. So we think there's good progress there. Of course, the big question is the fuel, as many would probably agree. So it's estimated that the global fuel production was around 100,000 tons green methanol the past couple of years, and for Maersk only we will need around 4 to 5 million tons green fuel in 2030. So of course there's a gap there. However, we do see an exponential development here, and which is probably also due to the sort of demand signals we start seeing from sort of the IMO, and we just closed a contract on 500,000 tons green methanol from China, and for China alone we see a pipeline of several million tons of green methanol the coming years. So it's a really strong development, but of course it's we need a stronger demand signal to get us to net zero. And so the point is also that for us it's really important that we don't get into a discussion of fuel availability at the IMO and with IMO measures. It is possible we will get the fuel if the IMO can get the clear and strong regulation in place. So that's also really important to say, because we start seeing stakeholders talking about fuel availability, as was the case with the sulfur discussion a couple of years ago, and that's really important we don't get into that. So we can do it, but we need the drivers, and you can say there's two drivers, either the demand from customers and in the end the consumers, and for that it's really important with the cargo owner initiatives that Catherine is probably going to talk about. And then the second one is the regulation, and we see increased demand also from consumers or the customer side, but we need we need more, and that is why we do need the global regulation in place in 2025 already. And what do we want from that? Well, I think from Maersk we can summarize in three main points we need from the regulation. Is first of all, it needs to close the gap, of course, between green and fossil fuels from day one. Secondly, it has to be well to wake, and that's back to the important discussion that Roald Hunters also talked about with the LCA guidelines that are extremely important. That is one aspect, but there's also a political point to it, that to make sure that the measures are actually regulated fully well to wake. And then the third point is to secure just transition. And it was also interesting to hear Mr. Sumabe talking about the energy projects and so on that could benefit from this, and this is really something we see that could be an advantage to use some of this revenue for energy projects and etc. Also in developing countries. So as we see it, we there's a number of proposals on the table, and one of them is from World Shipping Council, which we very much support, and I can go into details of that, but I can also pause it here if you want to take the sort of introductory remarks first.
Yeah, there's no time for that, unfortunately. We need to give the floor to the other speakers. Maybe, I mean, we'll see. I don't know that if that would be possible. But thank you, Sana, for these insights. Thank you. The next question is for Narinder. What are some key risks you're facing as a producer of shipping's future fuels in the current landscape, and how can policy measures support de-risking investment for you as a company? Narinder, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludovic. Let me kindly introduce briefly about my company, Avada. Avada is a renewable energy generator in India, and we are having operational renewable energy capacity of 4 gigawatts today. Another 2 gigawatt is under construction. We aim to be 11 gigawatt by 2026 and 30 gigawatt by 2030. And our targets are aligned with our national government's target of 500 gigawatts, which our Prime Minister has announced at COP27. So having said that, we as a established renewable energy generator are now diversifying into green molecule. We are setting up 500,000 ton green ammonia plant on the east coast of India in state of Odisha. To meet renewable energy requirement of this project, we are also setting up wind-based renewable energy block. On the same time, as I said, the prestigious targets of 30 gigawatt by 2030 to support supply chain, we are setting up our assembly line to make modules, PV modules in India, and also exploring possibility to make electrolyzers. So coming back to the question which moderator has just asked, the roadblocks which as a project developer we are facing, since we are aiming to set up 4 million ton of green ammonia in India by 2030, and we are setting up 500,000 ton capacities of biomethanol and green methanol put together in the state of Maharashtra. The major stumbling block is, I will say, I'll categorize 2 blocks. One in terms of lack of off-take agreements for green molecule, whether it is green ammonia or green methanol. We are in discussions with Maersk as well, Sana. In fact, because of the price difference of green ammonia vis-a-vis blue ammonia or gray ammonia, so we are finding it really difficult how to get through with the long-term off agreements. Long-term, when I say at least 10 years, because that is the first step required for taking lenders into confidence and achieving the FID. The second challenge, which I will say, even though there is a lot of discussions and lot of assurances from international community as well as from our own national government to support in terms of soft funding of such green molecule projects. But I should say that on ground reality, the lenders' condition are as stringent as for any gray or blue ammonia project per se. So I personally have not seen any relaxation or any support coming from lenders' perspective. So little bit, these are the 2 important stumbling blocks or roadblocks which we are working with various stakeholders to get through. Ultimately, we are very confident that clean fuels is the only option to remain sustainable, to achieve decarbonization, and to achieve the prestigious targets as we all are declaring. Regarding IMO support, I must thank IMO for supporting all through the last year by various means. That certainly the policy announcements or other announcements from IMO are really helping to bring green molecules to the day of light. But I will say that if IMO can support in terms of either subsidizing the fuel to marine industry so that this gap, viability gap funding is made possible for a short time maybe, because we expect that by 2029, the cost of green ammonia should be competitive to gray or blue, in fact. So when people are talking of uses of blue ammonia, they overlook the fact that the potential risks with handling of methane in manufacturing of blue ammonia or gray ammonia are quite high, are 28 to 30 times higher than as compared to hydrogen, which we will be making. So we are looking only at the cost part, not at the risk part of global warming potential. So I have a suggestion here if policymakers at IMO can consider. I understand IHI of Japan has already developed a 2 megawatt gas turbine, which is fueled by green ammonia or ammonia per se, but it can be on green ammonia thereafter. So if full blast green ammonia cannot be the fuel in short term from now, but to support the projects, we can start with the tugboats, which IHI of Japan is proposing to, because 2 megawatt gas turbine fueled by green ammonia can be very effectively used as a tugboat. So that can be the starting point, which will generate a lot of demand for green ammonia in marine industry. So that I'll put here that should be considered when we are making the other policies for enabling use of green ammonia as a future fuel, clean fuel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naim. Thank you for your suggestion. The next question is for Catherine. Catherine, through the Aspen Institute, the COSEF, and also recently launched ZEMBA initiatives play a key role in aggregating demand for zero-emission shipping. What are some of the key concerns you hear from the cargo owners, and what would you need to see from the policy measures to ensure demand for zero-emission shipping? Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the question and for hosting the discussion. Just a little bit of background about the initiatives for those who aren't familiar either with the Aspen Institute or COSEF or ZEMBA. We serve as the Secretariat of Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels, or COSEV, which is a platform designed for cargo owners to undertake high impact initiatives that accelerate maritime decarbonization. And the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, or ZEMBA, is a COSEV initiative that's really focused on kickstarting the transition by aggregating cargo owner demand for future zero-emission maritime shipping. And in fact, ZEMBA will announce the winner of its first zero-emission shipping tender later this spring. But ultimately, the cargo owners who are involved in these initiatives are engaged in paying attention to what policymakers are doing to support the transition to a decarbonized sector, and what they're doing to meet the goals of the IMO's revised GHG strategy. So to your question, a couple of issues that are top of mind when we talk to cargo owners. I'd say the first is that voluntary private sector action alone is not going to be enough to fully decarbonize the maritime industry. We are very much eager to support scaling of e-fuel production for maritime, but we recognize that the costs initially will be significantly higher than existing options. And in fact, we're learning quite a bit about how the market operates in the current policy environment through our first ZEMBA tender process. And what we're seeing is that climate-leading cargo owners, including those involved in ZEMBA, are willing to step up and be voluntary first movers, but they can't continue to make the business case for shouldering the cost of the transition forever. So this is why we recognize that timely, ambitious global policy is absolutely critical for success. Second, we hear a lot about the need for policies that are science-based, transparent, and clearly provide a pathway that moves us beyond existing fuels to e-fuels. Ultimately, cargo owners are really looking for a credible, predictable framework that provides sector-wide certainty and a more level playing field for their investments. And then finally, we get a lot of questions about fuels, including about the scalability and land use issues around biogenic fuels. We also get questions about how shipping can compete for the finite supply of e-fuels with other transportation modes that have greater buying power and fewer fuel options than maritime. So, to moving to the second part of your question, what does this mean in terms of policy? I think in the near term, one of the biggest issues that we will be focused on is, getting the IMO to finish its development of comprehensive LCA guidelines on a full well-to-wake basis with strict ILUC standards that are based on best available science. And just as an aside, we had to develop LCA guidelines for the Zemba tender. We drew on the IMO guidelines as they existed at the time, but we still had to fill in those gaps. And so we know that as long as biofuels are part of the near-term mix in this transition, transparency on how they're produced is of paramount importance. And there also must be independent third-party assurance on the verification of these fuels. And in terms of the measures, we need to see a credible, comprehensive transparency policy mechanisms that build on the momentum of what first movers are doing, but they also incentivize early investments in long-term solutions, as others have noted, to close that cost gap. And finally, we would like to see the measures support systems-wide transitions that are effective and equitable. So those are some of the issues and some of the policy ideas and discussions that we will be focused on in the coming meetings.
Thank you, Catherine, for these important messages coming from the cargo owners. We have time for a second round, actually. Jasper, I have another question. As a member of the steering committee of the comprehensive impact assessment, Rula already alluded to how active you are in a positive way in this group. What are some key concerns you've heard, and what are ways to address these concerns? Could you give some insights on this? The floor is yours, Jasper.
Thank you. Perhaps maybe also to reflect on what previous speakers have said. I noted a couple of points. So Catherine very clearly laid out that private action is not sufficient, that there needs to be regulatory impetus for shipping companies to change their ways. I think there was also to a large extent reflected by what Sanne from Maersk said, and this is something that we very clearly understand, and that is also at the basis of our proposals, that the European proposals to the next sessions, that shipping companies, ships, which ships are regulated by IMO, ships get a clear requirement, a clear obligation to move towards greener fuels, and not only towards partially greener fuels, but also already by 2030 towards green e-fuels, so the scalable green fuels, and I think also the ones that Avada produces, and we hope by setting a clear obligation on ships, that also the takeoff agreements that are the current main bottlenecks, I think, for the upscaling the production of these fuels will become less of an issue, because shipping companies will know well in advance how much demand there is, and perhaps also with intermediaries that can take on or supply to multiple shipping companies. This makes possible, I think, the signing of the offtake agreements that currently hold back investments in larger production. Then moving to the comprehensive impact assessment. As Roel explained, where we are yet with the comprehensive impact assessment is that we've seen the first results of some modeling of the impact on the fleet. So DNV, who is tasked with this part of the comprehensive impact assessment, has looked at the various policies proposals that the steering committee developed, and then for each of the policy proposals identified how the fleet would respond in terms of emissions, in terms of fuel mix. And there we see, and there I'm not speaking on behalf of the steering committee, but as a member of the steering committee and the observations from the Netherlands, that there are significant differences between the various policy proposals on the types of fuel that they incentivize to use. And based on those preliminary results, and of course we have to await the full results with the full modeling, and whether the results will be the same, but we are convinced that any regulation adopted at IMO should be on a well-to-wake basis, because otherwise the cheapest option to comply for a long time will be either fuels that are marginally better or gray ammonia, gray hydrogen, gray methanol, which actually, when you look at it on a global scale, will result in an increase in overall emissions, which is something that we do not like. So this is one of the key concerns we've heard. I must underline the comprehensive impact assessment. The end goal is to assess the impacts on states. We have not yet come to that point. There are not even preliminary results, so we have to await how that happens. What we've seen from other studies, not organized by the IMO or from the comprehensive assessment of the short-term measures that was conducted a couple of years ago, is that when you look at the impacts for most, I would say, large, diversified economies, regardless of whether they are classified in the UN system as developed states or developing states, the impacts are, I would say, small, but let's say in the order of 0.1 or 0.2% of GDP, and that is because a lot of substitution within the economies take place. The worst hit economies are either states that are really remote, like for example Pacific Island states, or states that are very dependent on imports or export of a few, and when you talk about exports, a few low value commodities as a major source of income for those countries. So think, for example, about African exporters of cacao, coffee, things like that. And it's those countries that we have to pay special attention to when we're looking towards addressing disproportionately negative impacts on states and also ensuring a just and equitable transition.
Okay, thank you very much, Jasper, for that. Yeah, and also for reflecting back on the comments that were made in the previous round and what you can do in your role as a policymaker to address all these things that were said, or some concerns as well. The next question is for Sanne. Sanne, referring to what you said before on the green balance mechanism, can you explain a bit how this mechanism proposed by the World Shipping Council will be capable of supporting the early uptake of green fuels?
Yes, thanks very much. And yeah, I mean, as mentioned, the World Shipping Council has proposed is one of the proposals of a pricing mechanism at the IMO, and as Roald Hunters mentioned, there's a number of proposals at the table, but this is one of them, and it sets a GHG fuel intensity value in a given year following the IMO GHG reduction trajectory. So it follows the target sort of And then the intention is that those vessels using a fuel that is performing inferior to that value has to pay, and the vessels performing better will receive an allocation, and that will be strengthened sort of during the years to get to net zero in 2050. So that is sort of the main parts of it, and of course it's full well to wake. That's important to say. So there is it's sort of a recycled fee, you can say fee-based, which also is contained in other proposals at the IMO. It's a fee-based mechanism. On top of that, we suggest that there's also a fee specifically for R&D and climate mitigation in developing countries. But we will leave that to member states to decide how much that should be. But so we focus on what does the industry need. And it is based, I mean, if anyone is interested, go to World Shipping Council's website where you can find the proposal. But it's based on assumptions and fuel prices, etc. To give you an example, a fee could be around starting with as little as $7 in 2027, but going to 70 in 2030 per ton CO2 equivalent. And then the allocation to green fuels will then be automatic. So it would be probably around 290, 300 per ton abated CO2 equivalent. So I hope that makes sense. And then so there's a recycled fee, you can say, in that, and it's proportionate to the GHG content of the fuel. So as to Jasper's point, of course, we have to also incentivize the ones that reduce the most. And in fact, this mechanism would also gradually, we use green methanol, but actually the one we use would start also paying at some point, because we cannot keep, we have to get to more than 65% reduction, which is one of the fuels we use now. So it will start paying also from 2035 or 38 or so. Yeah, so that's sort of the main aspects of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Asana. We have time for one question. Sorry, the question is addressed to Catherine. Sorry for that, but it's only Catherine, in your view, in addition to the cost gap, what are some of the other major barriers to cargo owners investing in reducing their Scope 3 emissions from maritime freight? Could you very quickly, in 1 or 2 minutes, give some insights on this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is definitely beyond just sort of some of the barriers that we talked about in my first question, which are significant, and we think that policy measures can help. It's important to kind of recognize that a lot of the Scope 3 emissions that cargo owners are trying to reduce are generally outside of their direct control. And so they're dependent on policymakers and others in the value chain to work with them to bring about the sort of necessary reduction for these emissions. And within sort of the overarching voluntary private sector-led investment in maritime decarbonization, another barrier that is artificially suppressing willingness to invest in zero-emission maritime solutions is related to carbon accounting. And this is something that we anticipate policymakers will have to grapple with at some point. In particular, claiming and reporting those emissions reductions associated with maritime decarbonization investments. So one of the biggest areas that we see that's going to need to be addressed in order for cargo owners to continue to be first movers in this area is the need for transparency in how emissions data are collected and reported. And this is crucial not only for regulatory compliance, both with existing and possible forthcoming emissions reporting schemes, but also in relation to how voluntary emissions reporting on target companies have been set through the Science-Based Target Initiative in compliance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol framework. And so we see sort of twofold solution to this challenge. It's first that SBTI must allow cargo owner investments to count towards their SBTI Scope 3 targets. Currently, these investments do not count. And so the second part of this is that the GHG protocol needs to allow Scope 3 emissions reductions to be reflected in their greenhouse gas inventories in the revised methodology. And if we don't address these issues, the market will not be able to tap into the full scope of voluntary investments that companies want to make. And this is significant because harnessing as much willingness to pay as possible, so these demand signals that we've talked about previously, is important to talk about sort of customer support for ambitious policy measures. So we are working with partners, including the AIM platform, to support development of practical, scalable systems that can harness funding from upstream customers to drive those technological change in hard-to-abate sectors and provide that clear guidance for accounting, claiming, and reporting the results of the efforts they support. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much. I think that's it for today. Thank you all for your contributions and insights. It was great to see all of you engaged in the discussion. And hopefully you can take away a lot from the experiences and remarks. We will be sharing the slides with you all, as well as a link to the recording. I think it will be posted on YouTube at a certain point. And we apologize also if we did not have time to answer your questions during the webinar. There's so many things to consider. I know there are a lot of things that have been raised here where I'm sure you would like to have more information on, but there will be other opportunities for that. And we will make sure to follow up the questions that you have afterwards. So thank you again for joining this webinar. I hope it was very useful. It was, for me at least, very, very useful I was happy to moderate this session, and I hope to see all of you somewhere soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.